What's up, ACC? I'm Angie, your children's minister with the Kidszone lesson for June 21st. It's review week. We had 8 different stories in Unit 21, which was called The Faithful Followers Returned. That's a lot to cover, so we are going to get right into briefly reviewing each of them. Our first story was called God Brought His People Home. God's people were leaving Babylon and returning to Jerusalem. King Cyrus made a new rule that the Israelites could return home and rebuild their temple. Zerubbabel led them on the 4-month journey. When they returned, each family built their house. Then they started work on the temple. They followed God's rules, and the priests built the new altar in the same place as the old one. The workers built the foundations. Everyone was happy. Our second story was called The Temple Was Completed. God's people were supposed to be completing the temple, but they stopped working on it. So God sent 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, to encourage them to finish. Tattenai, a helper of the Persian king who was watching over Judah, sent a letter to ensure that the people were allowed to build the temple. An old scroll was found that said it was. The king said to give the Israelites anything they needed, and soon the temple was complete. God's people happily celebrated. Our third story was called Esther Became Queen. Esther was the queen of Persia. She was also one of God's people, which made her a special person for a special job. Esther's cousin Mordecai overheard an evil plan to kill all of God's people. He asked Esther to stop a man named Haman. Esther was afraid. She knew that approaching the king uninvited was dangerous, but she also knew that she had to help her people. Esther asked Mordecai and the other Jews to pray and fast. Our fourth story was called God Saved His People Through Esther. Esther went to see the king after 3 days of the Jews praying and fasting. Esther was afraid. No one was supposed to go to the king unless he asked for them. Esther came closer, and the king held out his golden scepter, which meant she could approach. She asked him to bring Haman to a feast. After they ate, she asked them to come back the next day. After they ate, the king asked Esther what she wanted. She told him about Haman's plan to kill the Jews. The king was very angry. He ordered Haman to be killed and made a new law to protect God's people. Our fifth story was called Nehemiah Heard News of Jerusalem. Nehemiah was another one of God's people in Persia who worked for the king. Nehemiah heard that the walls of Jerusalem had been knocked down. He was sad. The king noticed his sadness and asked what was wrong. Nehemiah told the king about Jerusalem and asked to be sent there to help the people rebuild the walls. The king agreed and sent some supplies too. When Nehemiah arrived in Judah, he told the people to help him rebuild the walls. He told the people how God had helped him. The people agreed and started working to rebuild them. Our sixth story was called Jerusalem's Walls Were Rebuilt. Nehemiah went to Jerusalem to help God's people rebuild the walls and gates. All around the city, the people worked side by side. Some men who lived nearby were angry, though. They mocked the people and said the walls could not be rebuilt. Nehemiah prayed and reminded the people that God was with them. The people worked very hard, and in just 52 days, all the walls and gates were finished. When Jerusalem's enemies heard this, they were afraid because they knew that God was with his people. Our seventh story was called Ezra Read the Law. The walls of Jerusalem were finished. The people gathered to hear Ezra read God's law. Everyone listened and worshiped God together. The people were sad, though, because they realized that they were not following all of God's rules. Ezra told the people not to be sad, but to be happy. This was a happy day because they now understood God's laws and could follow them. The people listened to Ezra and prepared for a celebration. Our eighth and final story was called Malachi the Prophet. The Jewish people were ready for God to bless them. They waited, but nothing happened. God loved his people, but he wanted them to obey him. So God sent the prophet Malachi to talk to them. Malachi said that a day was coming when God would judge people on earth. God would send a messenger to get the people ready. Then God would send another messenger. And that messenger would be the Messiah God promised to send. Whew! That was a lot. Are you still with me? I knew you guys could do it. Great job, everyone. You can always go back and watch a past lesson video if you missed it too. Okay, our story of the week card is pretty simple this week. Play a review game with your family, talk about all 8 stories at dinner one night, you might have to break it up into a couple of nights. Which one was your favorite and why? And then we're going to get out your Gospel Project Family Bible and read more about these stories as a family. These stories are from the books of Ezra, Esther, Nehemiah, and Malachi. Be sure to pray with your family every day. Parents, join us at 9 p.m. on Facebook Live. And that's all I have for this week. Next week, we are starting our VBS lessons. If you haven't seen our commercial for how this year is going to work, then be sure to find it on our YouTube channel or Facebook page. For the next 5 weeks, we're going to learn about the 5 different stories that you all would have learned about in VBS. You don't want to miss out on our construction adventure called Concrete and